The South China Sea was quiet that night until it wasn't. A routine American Navy flight turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse when Chinese fighter jets locked onto a lone U.S. helicopter. What happened next was a mistake so reckless, so dangerous, it nearly sparked a war. This is the story of how China attacked the wrong helicopter and why it became a big mistake. It was a humid evening in the South China Sea, the kind of evening where the horizon seemed to blur with the ocean, leaving the world painted in shades of gray and gold. On board the USS Roosevelt, a massive Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, the deck hummed with activity. Helicopters were being fueled, sailors in yellow vests signaled to pilots, and the faint rumble of jet engines vibrated across the steel surface. Among the helicopters lined up was a Sikorsky MH-60 Seahawk, call sign Viper 1. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Mark Sullivan ran through his pre-flight checklist, his fingers moving over switches and dials with the kind of precision that only came from years of training. Hydraulics green. Fuel topped. Communications check. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade David Chen, nodded silently, checking his own set of instruments. Mark glanced over and smirked. You know, Chen, every time we fly over these waters, I can feel the tension in my bones. Feels like one wrong move and the whole world could go up in flames. Chen let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, well, considering the Chinese ships circling like sharks out here, I'd say your bones aren't lying. The USS Roosevelt had been patrolling disputed waters near the Spratly Islands for days. Officially, it was a freedom of navigation operation, but everyone on board knew it was also a message. A message to China, which claimed almost the entire South China Sea as its own. And the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy plan, wasn't taking the message kindly. As the Seahawk's rotors began to turn, the sound of blades cutting through the heavy air drew the attention of deck crew and sailors. Mark radioed in, Viper 1 ready for takeoff. Copy that, Viper 1. Cleared for departure, came the voice from the carrier's tower. With a steady pull, Mark lifted the Seahawk off the deck. The helicopter rose gracefully into the sky, the sea below stretching endlessly in all directions. From up there, the vastness of the ocean seemed almost peaceful, but Mark knew better. Underneath those calm waves lurked submarines, warships prowled just beyond radar, and jets screamed above in silent duels of intimidation. An hour into their patrol, the tension started to build. Chen spotted something on radar, a fast-moving object about 40 miles east, closing in on their position. Mark, you're going to want to see this. Speed and altitude match a fighter jet. Could be Chinese. Mark squinted at the green blip on the screen. Great. Just what we need. Let's keep eyes on it. Moments later, a voice crackled through their comm system, laced with a thick accent. Unidentified U.S. helicopter. You are entering Chinese territorial airspace. Turn around immediately, or you will be engaged. Chen's eyes widened. That's not a routine warning. Mark gripped the cyclic tighter. His voice stayed calm, but inside, his pulse was racing. This is Viper 1, United States Navy. We are operating in international airspace. Repeat, international airspace. We will continue our mission. Silence followed, the kind of silence that made your stomach knot. Then, out of nowhere, the shape of a Chengdu J-10 fighter screamed past their helicopter, so close that the Seahawk rocked violently in its wake. The roar of the jet's engine filled their ears, and Mark clenched his teeth. Jesus! Chen shouted. They're playing games. Mark steadied the chopper, forcing his breathing to slow. Not games, Chen. Warnings. They want to scare us back to the carrier. But it wasn't over. The J-10 circled back, this time flying alongside the Seahawk barely a few dozen meters away. The pilot's visor reflected the setting sun, and even from that distance, Mark could feel the hostility radiating from him. The fighter tilted slightly, showing off the missiles hanging under its wings. Chen muttered under his breath, He's not bluffing, Mark. He's itching for a reason. Back on the USS Roosevelt, radar operators were watching the encounter unfold with growing alarm. Commander Rachel Torres, the officer of the deck, leaned over the console. Get me direct comms with Viper 1. And patch me into the fighter's frequency. She spoke with authority. Chinese aircraft, this is Commander Torres of the United States Navy. You are endangering an American helicopter in international airspace. Disengage immediately. But the only reply was another aggressive maneuver. The J dove suddenly in front of the Seahawk, forcing Mark to pull back sharply to avoid a collision. The helicopter shook violently, alarms blaring as the rotor blades strained. Damn it, he's gonna get us killed, Mark shouted, sweat beading on his forehead. Then, in a moment that froze time itself, the J-10 banked hard to the right, locked onto the Seahawk, and the ominous tone of a radar lock filled the cockpit. The Chinese pilot had activated his targeting system. Chen's face went pale. He's locked us, Mark. He actually locked us. For a split second, Mark's thoughts raced. Training kicked in, protocol, survival maneuvers, the 1,000 drills he had practiced back in flight school. But beyond the training, there was also the crushing weight of reality. One wrong move here, one missile fired, and this wouldn't just be the end of Viper 1, it could ignite a war. Hold steady, Mark whispered more to himself than to Chen. His voice trembled but held firm. We don't show weakness. We don't flinch. The next 30 seconds felt like 30 hours. The J-10 kept the lock, daring them to panic. The Seahawk's engines groaned under the strain as Mark maneuvered to maintain altitude. He could see the sweat dripping down Chen's face, his hand frozen over the countermeasure switch. Finally, with a sudden snap, the Chinese pilot broke the lock and pulled away, climbing sharply into the fading twilight. The roar of the fighter faded into the distance, leaving only the whine of the Seahawk's rotors and the thundering of Mark's heartbeat in his ears. Chen let out a shaky laugh, more relief than humor. That was insane. I thought we were done. Mark didn't laugh. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the horizon. This isn't over, Chen. That wasn't just a scare tactic. That was a message. They wanted to see if we'd blink. Back on the USS Roosevelt, Commander Torres exhaled heavily as reports came in from Viper 1. Around her, sailors exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew what had just happened. And everyone knew what it meant. The Chinese hadn't just buzzed an American helicopter. They had threatened it, actively targeted it. And in doing so, they had crossed a line that could not be ignored. That night, as Mark and Chen returned to the carrier, the air on board was heavy with unspoken words. Sailors who normally joked and laughed after missions stayed quiet. The clatter of boots on steel echoed louder than usual. Because deep down, every man and woman aboard the Roosevelt knew something dangerous had shifted in the South China Sea. And they also knew the next encounter might not end with a warning. The mess hall aboard the USS Roosevelt was unusually quiet. Normally, after a long day of flight operations and drills, the room buzzed with laughter, card games, and the clatter of trays. But tonight, the sailors sat in small groups, whispering to each other in low voices, glancing at the flight crew from Viper 1 as they walked in. Mark Sullivan and David Chen could feel the weight of those stares. Mark grabbed a tray of food, though he had no appetite. The scrambled eggs and rice looked like cardboard, and the only thing he could taste was the bitter adrenaline that still lingered in his mouth. Chen sat across from him, poking at his meal with his fork. Finally, one of the younger sailors broke the silence. Hey, Lieutenant Sullivan, we heard what happened out there. Is it true? Did they actually lock you? The words hung in the air. Every ear in the mess hall turned toward them. Mark didn't want to talk about it, but there was no avoiding it. He nodded slowly. Yeah. They locked us. It wasn't a drill. That pilot wanted to see how far he could push. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Some sailors cursed under their breath. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. Everyone knew that a radar lock wasn't just a scare tactic. It was an act of aggression, a finger hovering over the trigger of a missile. Chen leaned forward, lowering his voice. We got lucky, Mark. Real lucky. He could have pulled the trigger. Mark stared at his untouched food. Yeah. But what happens when it's not luck? What happens when the next guy decides to finish what this one started? The next morning, the Roosevelt's briefing room was filled with officers, pilots, and intelligence analysts. Commander Rachel Torres stood at the front, a grim expression on her face. Behind her, a large digital screen displayed maps of the South China Sea, dotted with icons representing U.S. and Chinese vessels. "We have confirmation," Torres began, her voice steady but sharp. "Yesterday's incident was no accident. Satellite imagery shows that the Chinese Navy has increased its patrols in this sector. They're testing us, probing our resolve." She clicked to the next slide, showing images of Chinese destroyers and frigates shadowing the Roosevelt's carrier group. This is not an isolated encounter. It's part of a broader pattern. And make no mistake, things are escalating. Mark sat in the back, his fists clenched under the table. He could still hear the sound of the radar lock, the shrill, soul-piercing tone that had haunted his dreams the night before. After the briefing, Torres called Mark and Chen into her office. She looked them both in the eyes. "You two handled yourselves well. You didn't panic. You didn't escalate. That's exactly what I expect from my pilots." Mark nodded, though the praise did little to ease the knot in his stomach. "With respect, ma'am, that pilot wanted to start something. What happens when they push harder?" Torres leaned back in her chair, sighing. "Then we push back. But not before. Our job is to keep the peace, as fragile as it is. Don't forget that." Later that afternoon, Mark found himself standing on the flight deck, staring out at the endless blue. The sun shimmered on the waves, but to him, the ocean didn't look peaceful anymore. It looked like a battlefield waiting to erupt. He was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of boots approaching. Chen joined him, hands tucked in his flight vest. "You ever think about how crazy this all is? We're flying $1,000 machines, carrying millions in equipment, and all it takes is one itchy trigger finger to start a war no one wants." Mark chuckled bitterly.
"Yeah.
And we're the ones sitting in the crosshairs." A few days later, the Roosevelt launched another patrol. This time, Viper 1 wasn't alone. Two F/A-18 Hornets escorted the Seahawk, flying in loose formation above and behind. The message was clear. The United States wasn't going to let its helicopters fly unprotected anymore. At first, the mission was uneventful. The Seahawk scanned the seas below, its sensors sweeping for submarines and unidentified vessels. Mark and Chen kept their eyes on the horizon, listening to the steady hum of the rotors. Then, once again, radar picked up a fast-moving contact, two Chinese J-10s, closing in from east. Chen muttered, "Here we go again." The Hornet pilots immediately responded, locking their radars onto the incoming fighters. Over the radio, one of them spoke calmly but firmly. "Chinese aircraft, this is U.S. Navy Hornet 2-1. You are approaching a United States helicopter under escort. Any hostile action will be met with defensive response." For a few tense moments, the jets circled each other in the sky, predators sizing each other up. Then one of the J-10s made its move, swooping low, passing just meters below the Seahawk, and climbing back up in a show of defiance. The Hornets mirrored the maneuver, forcing the Chinese fighters to pull back. Mark's knuckles turned white on the controls. "They're testing us again, seeing how close they can get without crossing the line." Chen's voice cracked with frustration. "One of these days, someone's gonna miscalculate." And then, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Both of them knew the outcome would be catastrophic. That night, after they returned safely, Mark couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He found himself staring at an old photograph he kept tucked in his locker. A picture of his wife, Emily, and their daughter, Sophie, smiling in front of their home back in Virginia. He ran his thumb over the photo, fighting the lump in his throat. Chen walked by and saw the picture. "She looks just like you," he said softly. Mark smiled faintly.
"Yeah.
She's got my stubbornness too. Emily says she's already a handful." Chen hesitated before asking, "Do you ever wonder what happens if we don't come back one of these days?" Mark's smile faded. He closed the locker and looked his co-pilot in the eyes. "Every damn day." Meanwhile, halfway across the world, in Beijing, military officials were reviewing the same incidents. On a long mahogany table, Chinese generals discussed the reckless actions of the U.S. Navy. They spoke of sovereignty, of defending national pride, of sending a message that China would not back down. One general, a stern man with silver hair, slammed his fist on the table. "They do not fear us. They think we bluff. We must prove otherwise." And so orders were given. The next encounter would not be another warning. A week later, the Roosevelt's task force received intelligence of increased Chinese activity near the Paracel Islands. Rumors spread quickly among the crew. Tension tightened like a noose around every conversation. Mark and Chen were assigned another patrol, once again flying Viper 1. The Hornets were on standby, but this time, the orders were different. Do not provoke. Do not escalate, but defend yourselves if engaged. As they lifted off, Mark felt the weight of those words. Defend if engaged, which meant the higher-ups believed engagement was now a real possibility. Hours into the patrol, radar lit up again. Not one, not two, but 4 Chinese fighters approaching fast. Chen swallowed hard. 4. That's not a patrol. That's a strike team. The comms crackled. U.S. helicopter. This is Chinese Military Air Command. You are in violation of our airspace. Turn back immediately, or you will be fired upon. Mark's blood ran cold. This wasn't the usual harassment. This was a direct threat. Before he could respond, the cockpit filled with the shrill alarm of a radar lock. Then another. And another. All 4 fighters had locked onto the Seahawk. Chen's hands trembled over the countermeasure switches. "Mark, they've got us boxed in." Mark's voice was steady, but his chest tightened with fear. "Stay calm. We're not running." Outside, the sun glinted off the sleek bodies of the J-10s as they formed a deadly circle around Viper 1. The pilots inside weren't bluffing anymore. Their fingers hovered over triggers. Their missiles were armed. This time, there would be no easy escape. The cockpit of Viper 1 felt smaller than ever. The steady hum of the Seahawk's rotors was drowned out by the piercing radar warning alarms that screamed in Mark's ears. 4 red lights flashed across the console, each representing a Chinese J-10 locked onto them. The sky outside, once endless and blue, now felt like a cage. Chen's voice cracked, panic bubbling under the surface. "Mark, they've got us surrounded. All 4 are locked. What do we do?" Mark's knuckles were white on the controls. He forced his breathing to slow, willing himself to think. "Stay steady. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Remember what Torres said, defend only if engaged." But the weight of those words pressed down on him like a stone. Defend if engaged. That meant if one missile streaked toward them, they would have no choice but to retaliate. But what could a Seahawk helicopter do against 4 fully armed fighters? The comms crackled again. U.S. helicopter, last warning. You are in Chinese airspace. Turn around now, or we will fire. Chen looked at Mark, his eyes wide with fear. They're serious this time. They're not bluffing. Mark took a deep breath, his voice steady as he keyed the mic. "This is Viper 1, United States Navy. We are operating in international airspace. Repeat, international airspace. We will not turn around." Silence. Then the J-10 on their left pulled slightly ahead, its sleek body glinting in the sunlight. The pilot tilted his jet, exposing the deadly payload beneath his wings. Then, with chilling clarity, the tone in Viper 1's cockpit shifted. One of the locks had gone from warning to active. "Missile lock," Chen shouted, his voice breaking. "Mark, he's got a hard lock." Mark's stomach twisted. His mind raced through the possibilities. Evasive maneuvers? Pointless. The Seahawk was too slow. Deploy countermeasures? It might buy seconds, maybe. Call for backup? The Roosevelt was miles away. Hornets could take minutes to arrive. And in this game, minutes were the difference between life and death. But before Mark could act, another voice came through the comms. Deep, commanding, and distinctly American. "This is Hornet 2-1. Chinese fighters, disengage immediately. You are targeting a U.S. Navy helicopter in international airspace. Break lock now, or you will be fired upon. Relief surged through Mark as two F/A-18 Hornets appeared in the distance, streaking across the sky like guardian angels. The Hornets split into attack positions, locking their own radars onto the Chinese jets. The standoff escalated in an instant. 8 planes, 4 Chinese, 2 American Hornets, 1 Seahawk, and the tension of a world holding its breath. Chen whispered, "Oh my God. This is it, Mark. This is how war starts." The Chinese jets didn't flinch. They kept their lock on Viper 1, daring the Americans to make the first move. The sky felt electric, every second stretching into eternity. Mark could almost see the invisible threads of war pulling tighter and tighter, ready to snap. Inside his helmet, sweat dripped into his eyes. He blinked it away, his mind flashing back to Emily and Sophie. His daughter's laughter, her little hand gripping his thumb, the way Emily kissed him goodbye before deployments. Was this how it ended? Trapped in a helicopter, surrounded by enemies, with death just a trigger pull away? The Hornet pilot's voice came again, sharper, angrier. "Chinese fighters, you are outnumbered and outgunned. Break your lock now, or we will engage. This is your final warning." For a moment, no one moved. Then, with almost unbearable slowness, the lead J-10 released its lock. The shrill alarm in Viper 1's cockpit stopped. One by one, the others followed suit. The relief was instant but fragile. The J-10s didn't retreat. They stayed close, shadowing the Seahawk, but their weapon systems powered down. Mark exhaled, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Chun, we're still alive." Chun laughed weakly, the sound tinged with disbelief. "Barely." The Hornets stayed close as escorts, guiding Viper 1 back toward the Roosevelt. But the damage had already been done. The Chinese hadn't fired, but they had crossed another line. They had locked their weapons on an American helicopter. And everyone knew it wouldn't be the last time. Back on the carrier, the debriefing room was filled with tension. Commander Torres paced the floor, her jaw tight, her fists clenched. They locked 4 fighters on 1 helicopter. That is an act of aggression. I don't care what Beijing says about sovereignty. That was a deliberate provocation. An intelligence officer added, "Satellite data confirms it." Those J-10s were fully armed. If the Hornets hadn't shown up, they might have taken the shot. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. If the Chinese had fired, the U.S. would have been forced to retaliate. Missiles, counterstrikes, escalation, spiraling into a war neither side truly wanted. Mark sat at the back of the room, his mind replaying the encounter in endless loops. The shrill alarm, the Chinese pilot's visor glinting in the sun, the crushing knowledge that at any second, his life could have ended. He felt hollow, drained, but underneath it all, something else burned. Anger. After the meeting, Torres approached him. "You did everything right, Sullivan. You stayed calm. You followed protocol. But I need you to be ready, because the next time we might not get out so clean." Mark nodded silently, though inside, a storm raged. How many more close calls before one side pushed too far? How long before his luck, and his daughter's chance to see him again, ran out? That night, he found himself on the flight deck again, staring at the dark waves. The stars stretched above him, beautiful and indifferent. Chen joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep either?" Mark took the cup, sipping the bitter liquid. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear that alarm. Over and over. It doesn't stop." Chen stared out at the horizon. "You ever think about what happens if we don't come back? I mean, who tells my mom? Who tells your wife?" Mark didn't answer at first. Then he said quietly, "I think about it every time I step into that cockpit. But that's the job, Chen. We fly. We take the risks. Because if we don't, who will?" Thousands of miles away, in Beijing, the Chinese general who had demanded action sat in a dimly lit room, reviewing reports. His advisors urged caution, but he shook his head. "The Americans think they can patrol our waters without consequence. Next time, we will show them we are serious. Next time, they will not leave unharmed." And so, orders were passed down. Fighter pilots were instructed that in the next encounter, they were authorized to fire warning shots. A step closer to the edge. A week later, Viper 1 was once again in the air. This time, Mark felt the heaviness in his chest before they even left the deck. He didn't say it out loud, but something inside him whispered, "Today will be different." 2 hours into the patrol, radar lit up again. Fast movers. Chen cursed under his breath. They're back. 3 contacts closing in. Mark adjusted his grip on the controls. Let's see what they've got this time. The J-10s appeared out of the clouds, sleek and menacing. But this time, they didn't just lock on. This time, they fired. 3 bright flashes streaked across the sky, not missiles, but bursts of tracer fire, ripping through the air just yards ahead of the Seahawk's nose. Warning shots. A message written in fire and thunder. Chen shouted, ducking instinctively. They're shooting at us. Mark's heart pounded as he yanked the controls, pulling the Seahawk into a desperate evasive maneuver. The rotor screamed in protest as the helicopter dipped low, skimming the ocean's surface. Spray exploded around them as bullets tore into the waves. This wasn't a bluff anymore. This was the beginning. The Seahawk screamed across the waves, its engines straining as Mark forced the helicopter lower, skimming the ocean like a stone skipping across water. Salt spray lashed the windshield, mixing with the acrid smell of burning oil as warning lights flickered across the dashboard. Chen clung to the console, his voice high with panic. "Mark, they're firing at us." "That wasn't a lock. That wasn't a bluff. Those were bullets." "I know." Mark snapped, his voice sharp not with anger, but with the desperate focus of survival. "Hold on." Tracer rounds ripped through the sky, arcing like fiery comets above the Seahawk's tail. Each streak of light was a reminder of just how fragile they were, thin metal, spinning blades, and 2 men caught in the middle of a storm they hadn't started. The J-10s roared overhead, circling like wolves around their prey. Then one dipped low, cutting across the Seahawks' path and releasing another short burst of fire. This one closer, so close that Mark could hear the crack of rounds tearing through the air beside them. Chen's hands hovered over the countermeasure panel. "Flares? Chaff. Tell me what to do." "Not yet," Mark barked. Deploying now would only confirm to the Chinese that he believed a missile was incoming. That, in turn, could provoke them to escalate further. This wasn't just about flying anymore, it was about reading the psychology of the pilots hunting them. Over the comms, a voice broke through, harsh and triumphant. "U.S. helicopter, you have ignored our warnings. This is your last chance. Turn back or we will destroy you." Chen stared at Mark, his face pale. "They mean it, Mark. They'll kill us." Mark's jaw tightened. "Not if we make it too costly for them." At that moment, the Roosevelt's Combat Information Center erupted with alarms. Screens lit up, showing the Seahawk in distress, surrounded by hostile fighters. Commander Torres slammed her fist on the console. "Get the Hornets in the air, now." "Ma'am, that's escalation," an officer began, but Torres cut him off. "They've already escalated. They fired on my crew. Scramble the fighters." On the deck, pilots sprinted to their jets. The roar of engines shook the carrier as F/A-18 Hornets thundered into the sky, their afterburners blazing in the twilight. The Roosevelt wasn't just protecting a helicopter now, it was protecting its honor, its people, and its presence in contested waters. Back in the Seahawk, alarms shrieked louder. A warning flashed, hydraulic pressure low. One of the stray rounds had clipped the tail, severing a line. The controls felt heavier in Mark's hands, sluggish, unresponsive. Chen's voice broke. "We're hit. Mark, we can't take another round like that." Mark gritted his teeth, forcing the Seahawk to hold steady despite the damage. "We'll make it. We have to." The Chinese jets circled again, but before they could strike, a new voice cracked through the comms, loud and defiant. "This is Hornet 3-3. Chinese fighters, disengage immediately. Any further hostile fire will be answered with lethal force." In the distance, streaks of light cut through the sky. American Hornets, diving in fast. The cavalry had arrived. The balance of power shifted in an instant. The Chinese jets now faced equal opponents, and the tone of the standoff changed. No longer was it an easy target, a lone helicopter. Now it was a fight they might not win. Still, one of the J-10s broke formation, diving aggressively toward the Seahawk again. Mark's heart seized as tracer rounds lit the air, but this time, an American Hornet cut across the path, locking onto the attacker with its AAM-9 Sidewinders. The radio screamed, "Chinese fighter, break off. You're targeted. Break off now." The J-10 wavered, then veered away sharply, the pilot realizing he had pushed too far. But the danger wasn't over. In Beijing, the Chinese military watched the unfolding confrontation via satellite feeds and radar reports. Pride clashed with fear in the war room. To retreat would look weak. To attack would risk open war. One general growled, "They will not leave these waters unscathed. Fire another warning shot." In the skies, the order was obeyed. Another J-10 banked low and unleashed a burst, not at the Seahawk this time, but into the water just ahead of it. The rounds kicked up fountains of spray, a message written in salt and thunder. Chen gasped. "They're hurting us, Mark. They're trying to force us back." Mark's hands shook as he fought to keep the Seahawk stable. "We're not running. Not today." At that moment, Commander Torres's voice boomed into their headsets. "Viper 1, hold your position. Reinforcements inbound. You are not alone." And then the horizon lit up. More Hornets, a full squadron this time, streaked across the sky in tight formation. The roar of their engines was a symphony of defiance. The Americans had arrived in force. The Chinese jets hesitated. They were outnumbered now, outgunned, and dangerously close to crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Mark could almost feel the shift in the air. The hunters had become the hunted. Still, the standoff dragged on. Every second stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. No one wanted to be the first to fire a missile. No one wanted to be the spark that lit the powder keg of a global war. Mark whispered to Chen, "This is bigger than us. Way bigger." Chen's eyes glistened with fear, but also with something else, resolve. "Then let's make sure we don't screw it up." The Hornet leader's voice cut through the silence. "Chinese fighters, this is your final warning. Disengage immediately, or we will defend ourselves and our helicopter." The sky was silent except for the rumble of engines. The J-10s flew tight, their formation flawless, their resolve palpable. Then, slowly, one by one, they broke off, banking east, retreating into the horizon. The relief in the Seahawk's cockpit was overwhelming. Chen let out a shaky laugh, tears of adrenaline streaming down his face. "We're alive. Holy hell, Mark, we're alive." Mark didn't laugh. He stared at the empty sky where the fighters had been, his expression grim. For now. Back aboard the Roosevelt, the Seahawk landed hard, its damaged tail groaning against the deck. Sailors rushed forward, helping Mark and Chen out of the cockpit. Commander Torres was there, her face pale but resolute. She gripped Mark's shoulder. "You brought her home. That's what matters." But Mark shook his head. "They fired on us, ma'am. They crossed the line. This won't be the last time." Torres's eyes darkened. "I know, which is why we're preparing for what comes next." That night, the Roosevelt's war room buzzed with activity. Maps spread across tables, strategies debated, messages sent back to Washington. The incident would not stay hidden. Within hours, the Pentagon would know. Within days, the world would. And in Beijing, the generals made their own plans. Pride had been wounded, and wounded pride was dangerous. For Mark, sleep was impossible. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, hearing again the crack of bullets, the scream of alarms, the haunting thought of how close he had come to never seeing Emily and Sophie again. In the darkness, he whispered to himself, "Next time, we might not get out." And he knew there would be a next time. The Roosevelt's command center was bathed in the pale glow of computer screens, the air thick with urgency. Reports flew across the room like sparks from a fire, radar sightings, intercepted communications, satellite updates. Every sailor, Every officer felt it in their bones. The next move would decide not just the fate of the Roosevelt's crew, but the balance of power in the South China Sea. Commander Rachel Torres stood at the center of it all, her voice sharp and steady. The Chinese fired warning shots at one of ours. They damaged an American helicopter. Washington has been notified, and we've been ordered to hold position but remain ready to respond. The room buzzed with tension. Hold position was military code for don't retreat, don't provoke, but if you're attacked again, hit back. Everyone knew it. Meanwhile, down in the hangar bay, Mark Sullivan and David Chen sat beside their battered Seahawk, watching mechanics patch bullet holes and replace damaged systems. The smell of oil and hydraulic fluid filled the air, but neither man spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was heavy. Chen finally broke it. Mark, I keep thinking about those rounds hitting the water. If the pilot had pulled the trigger a fraction higher. Mark stared at the helicopter, his voice low. We wouldn't be here. We'd be names carved into a memorial. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. We can't keep playing this game of chicken. Someone's going to lose their nerve. And when that happens, Chen finished the thought, it won't just be us. That night, the Roosevelt's loudspeakers crackled to life. All hands, general quarters. All hands, general quarters. This is not a drill. Sailors scrambled through the corridors, boots pounding steel, voices raised in urgency. Mark and Chen rushed to the ready room, hearts racing. On the big screen at the front, live radar feeds showed a Chinese flotilla advancing, destroyers, frigates, and support vessels, cutting across the waves in perfect formation. Commander Torres's voice was grim. They're sending a message. They want us gone. And they're willing to force the issue. The Roosevelt's carrier group shifted into battle formation. Hornets roared off the deck. Destroyers moved into defensive positions, and every sailor aboard felt the weight of history pressing down on them. This was the closest the United States and China had come to open conflict in decades. Mark turned to Chen. If this is it, if this is where it all goes down. Chen cut him off with a shaky smile. Then let's make it count. The standoff stretched into hours. American jets streaked across the sky, Chinese fighters shadowed them, and the sea churned with the wakes of warships glaring at each other across miles of contested water. It was a chessboard of steel and firepower, and every move risked checkmate. Then, as dawn broke, it happened. A Chinese destroyer fired its deck gun. Not at the Roosevelt, not at the Hornets, but at the sea just 100 yards in front of an American destroyer. A warning shot, thunderous and unmistakable. The Roosevelt's decks vibrated as alarms blared. Sailors braced at their stations. One wrong order, one panicked finger on a trigger, and the ocean would erupt. Torres stood firm in the CIC, her jaw clenched. Hold fire. Do not return fire unless directly targeted. But in the skies above, the Chinese made their mistake. 3 J-10s broke formation, diving toward the Roosevelt's flight deck. Their intent was clear. Buzz the carrier, intimidate, humiliate. But in their arrogance, in their reckless attempt to send a message, one pilot came too close. Too close to the wrong helicopter. Viper 1. Mark and Chen had been ordered back into the air at first light, their Seahawk patched just enough to fly. They weren't supposed to engage, just observe, monitor, and serve as eyes in the sky. But as the J-10 screamed down toward the Roosevelt, it cut directly across the Seahawk's path, misjudging the distance. Mark yanked the controls instinctively, pulling the Seahawk up and sideways. The J-10 pilot, perhaps overconfident, perhaps careless, overcorrected his dive. In a flash of horror, his jet clipped the Seahawk's rotor tip. The sky exploded in chaos. The Seahawk lurched violently, alarm screaming. Mark fought the controls, his muscles burning, his breath ragged. The J-10 spun out of control, flames trailing from its wing as the pilot ejected, his parachute blossoming against the dawn sky. Chen shouted over the noise. We're losing it. Mark, we're going down. No, Mark roared, every ounce of his willpower focused on the controls. Not today. Not like this. The Seahawk bucked and shuddered, but Mark wrestled it back from the edge, dragging it into a desperate, barely controlled descent. The ocean loomed, frothing and merciless. At the last possible second, the helicopter leveled out, slamming hard into the waves but staying afloat. Sailors aboard the Roosevelt cheered, their relief deafening. Viper 1 was battered, half-submerged, but alive. The Chinese, however, had just made the biggest mistake of all. By clipping an American helicopter in international airspace, they had crossed from intimidation into reckless aggression. And the world was watching. Cameras on the Roosevelt, satellites overhead, even civilian ships nearby. Every lens caught the collision, every ear heard the alarms. In Washington, the footage was transmitted within minutes. In Beijing, generals scrambled to spin the narrative. But it was too late. The truth was undeniable. China had attacked the wrong helicopter. The Roosevelt CIC was electric with emotion. Sailors pounded consoles, fists raised, voices shouting in both anger and relief. Commander Torres spoke into the comms, her tone steel. Message to Beijing. You endangered American lives. You humiliated yourselves. And now the world knows it. Mark and Chen were pulled from the Seahawk by rescue boats, soaked, shivering, but alive. On the deck of the Roosevelt, sailors surrounded them, clapping their backs, hugging them, voices filled with gratitude. Chen laughed through tears. We cheated death again, Mark. Twice in 1 week. We're gonna run out of luck. Mark held the photograph of Emily and Sophie in his trembling hands, his voice cracking.
No.
Not luck. Not today. Just stubbornness. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Headlines blazed. Chinese jet collides with U.S. helicopter. Tensions erupt in South China Sea. Big mistake. China's aggression backfires. Instead of intimidating the Americans, the collision had united them. The Roosevelt's crew stood taller, prouder. Washington doubled its resolve. And across the world, allies pointed to the footage as proof of China's recklessness. For the Chinese pilot, ejected and rescued by his own navy, the mission had been a humiliation. For Beijing, it was a diplomatic disaster. And for Mark Sullivan and David Chen, it was survival, barely. But survival nonetheless. As the sun set over the South China Sea that evening, Mark stood on the deck of the Roosevelt, the ocean wind whipping across his face. Beside him, Chen leaned against the railing, silent. Finally, Chen spoke. Think they'll try again? Mark's eyes hardened as he stared at the horizon. Maybe. But next time, they'll think twice. Because they attacked the wrong helicopter. The waves crashed below, endless and eternal. But in that moment, Mark felt something stronger than fear. Not victory. Not relief. But defiance. They had been tested, pushed, nearly broken. And yet they stood. And in the silence of the sea, with the carrier lights glowing behind him, Mark whispered a promise, not just to Emily and Sophie, not just to the men and women aboard the Roosevelt, but to himself. We're still here, and we're not going anywhere.